You know, one thing, I love beating up the consensus media. Other people call it the mainstream media, the liberal media, but I think consensus is the right word. One place, though, where I have to praise even my rivals are the Toronto Star and the CBC, and frankly, almost every newspaper across this country is on freedom of speech and the censorship provision. Over the last 5 years, I've been fighting against these censorship commissions. Even the Toronto Star and the CBC have come out against the censorship section. Imagine my shock to open the paper today and see my friend David Akin, the host of the Sun News Network's own show, The Daily Brief, supporting the censorship provision. Well, this could not stand. I invited David to come on the show and answer for his censorship-loving ways. David, thanks for agreeing to come on and make the case that I am surprised to hear you make.
Well, and I should start. I wade into this very carefully with you of all people, Ezra, because, of course, A, you're a lawyer and I'm not one. B, you have spent years being a free speech champion and you ought to be applauded for that. I'm a journalist. I'm a free speech guy by definition. There's all sorts of issues that I would like to see our federal government do to improve and protect free speech for journalists, free speech for anybody here. But your monologue notwithstanding, it was a delightful monologue. It raised a whole bunch of interesting issues, and I agree we should talk about human rights tribunals from here till the cows come home. But it kind of sidesteps the issue that I talked about in my column, that the court is being asked to rule on. And simply put, I mean, there's a couple of fine point issues, but basically it's saying we have some prohibitions against hate speech that are on the books that courts decide, not just the criminal code ones. But we have in a civil context, we have some laws against hate speech. And the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, way back when, took a look at something the Supreme Court already said that you referenced. That was what Beverly McLaughlin was arguing about in 1990, the Taylor case. And they said, yes, we're going to apply the tests from the Taylor case, that 21-year-old case against Mr. Watcott, and we're going to see what turns up. And they said that this is hateful and there ought to be some sanction for it. Now, what is the Supreme Court being asked to do? They're not being asked to expand restrictions on speech. They're not being asked to go somewhere that they haven't gone before. They're simply being asked today and in the next coming days to say, is the standard for hatred sufficiently precise? Is it limited and restricted enough like it was back in the 1990 case? The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and at least one judge in the Court of the Queen's Bench in Saskatchewan says yes, and I say yes too. It is sufficiently precise. It is a reasonable, precise, very limited limit on free speech. And so the Supreme Court ought to do what it did in 1990 and say, that's it, we're not going any further. Let's reaffirm that fact that this is as far as we go towards hate speech.
I want to jump in on a couple points.
Okay.
First of all, you're correct to say that the federal version of this law was treated by the Supreme Court 21 years ago. But this provincial version that I read out at some length today is different. It's so much more loosey-goosey. It talks about an affront to dignity. David, tell me that you don't seriously think that you should be prosecuted and fined for affronting someone's dignity. That's language in the Saskatchewan law that's not in the federal. Do you really think that, not for punching someone in the nose or stealing something, but you, sir, have affronted my dignity, that someone should be fined 17 grand?
You're only reading half of the line there. And let me read the whole line to you. That exposes or tends to expose to hatred. Blah, 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 affronts the dignity. So we come back to the definition of hatred. What is hateful speech? And let me read you. You in your monologue sketch up Mr. Whatnot as, pleasant house, he kind of goes.
He says hateful things. Let's admit, I feel, what normal human being doesn't feel hatred? David, why are we trying to criminalize a human emotion?
Here's what Watcott said. It just wasn't like disagreeing. And by the way, freedom of religion, you raised that, Carnard. Nobody's talking about freedom of religion.
That's what motivates Watcott. He's motivated by his Christian beliefs. It may motivate him, but we're just issued it is what he said hateful. If I said to you, if I said something that was hateful about Jews, blacks, aboriginals, whatever, we wouldn't be getting into freedom of religion, and we're not here. It's simply, it was hateful on its face. Let me say, here's a quote from one of his flyers. Our children will pay the price in disease, death, abuse, if we do not say no to the sodomite desire to socialize your children. Here's something else. He talks about sodomites and lesbians who want to remain in their lifestyle and process. So
he's essentially saying homosexuals are predatory pedophiles.
Yes, so what?
That is hateful stuff and should be denounced. And in this case,
are you saying that anyone who has hateful feelings should be we should make it illegal to have hateful feelings in this country?
No, not at all. I'm saying that in terms of speech, we agree that there are some limits on free speech. I think you both and I agree. You
Not for political speech. I don't believe in political limits on political speech. Why can't someone use the word sodomite? I don't use it. Why can't someone say death? Jews are liars. That was another example from your column. Jews are liars. I don't agree with that. Why should it be against the law to say something? Even don't we have the right to be wrong, David? Don't we have the right to be stupid? Of course. But in your column today, let me quote you. Say, in publicly attacking all homosexuals, Whatcott is deserving the same sex. You're using the word attack. He's not attacking anyone. He's just using foul language.
No, it's hateful. It's hateful language is what it is. So we should call it for what it is. It's hateful.
It's the emotion is the crime.
Your issue is whether or not that ought to be illegal, but we can both agree that it's hateful language. That's hateful language, and it should be sanctioned by the very least by those of us saying that's hateful language. You want to bring forward some views about something? Let's have a discussion.
I'm not saying that we should accept everything that Whatcott or any other hater says. I'm saying the right answer is for you to write a column condemning them and people to campaign against them. That's the limit for me. You just said at the very least we should condemn them. Fine. I'm saying that should be the very most. What business is it, David, of a court to come in and say we are now going to tell you with the power of the state that you have the wrong opinion?
Right, and this is the interesting part of the argument. Let's get past all the anti-gay stuff, pro-gay religion. This is, I think, the interesting part of the discussion is, does a state have the right to limit speech that is not criminal? And we both agree a state has the right to prohibit criminal speech that would incite violence. We saw in Egypt on the weekend.
Right,
we saw a state broadcaster
you're saying
go kill
that
the
merely
Christians.
being mean in offending someone's dignity and causing emotional harm is enough for the state to come in. I don't think you mean that, David. I do not think you mean that the government should be so powerful that if someone uses insulting language, they should be hauled before a court. Do you really mean that, David?
And in fact, no, of course I don't mean all of that. What I mean is the court in 1990, I would have agreed with the majority. It was a split decision, 4-3. McLaughlin, as you mentioned, passionate advocate, etc. And now she is asking to review what the court did in 1990, the very limited test it has to find illegal, hateful speech. And if you find it's hateful, and if you find it is harming people, using a narrow test.
No, but there's no harm test. No, David, there's no test for harm. You don't have to actually hurt someone. It just has to be an affront to their dignity. It's a test for offensiveness, not for real. If you're actually harming someone, if you're punching them, if you're destroying their property, hey, let the law have it. But there's no harm test here, David. It's just a hurt feelings test. Are you saying that's now something that the state has to protect?
Well, I think the state does have to protect minorities from exposure to hatred by the majority. Actually, you know what? Let me rephrase that, because this is one of the issues I think we will find some agreement on. I think if we're going to have these human rights tribunals, it ought to be on guard, on watch against hateful speech, period, and majorities can be harmed just as well. You talked about radical imams, and we know any number of groups that are calling for death, destruction, extermination of Christians, of white guys, of who knows, you name it. That ought to be, we ought to be equalist and censorious and apply these same laws that limit and restrict speech in a small way, that we ought to make that kind of speech just as illegal as well, or open to some sort of sanction.
I can't.
You're not going to agree with me on that one, but that's where I'm saying there is a place for the state to say, on this small line, we can draw the line right there.
You know what? If someone is uttering a death threat or inciting to violence, the cops can handle it. You are saying that you want the government to arbitrate hurt feelings and the natural human emotions of hate. David, do you really think passing a law can change if someone feels love or hate? Do you really think that you're going to change Bill Whatcott's mind because you criminalize him or you give him a $17,000 fine?
Well, for one thing, I would love to see a government pass a law that says we all have to love each other. I would like to see how that works. Can we all please get along
that's
and
what
love
this
each
law
other?
is called. That's what the law you're defending is called, because you're trying to outlaw the natural human emotion of hate. You know where they outlaw hate? Places like Saudi Arabia. You're not allowed to speak out if you hate something, and that's why they resort to terrorism. Oh, my God, David. I thank you for coming on the show. You've evoked certain feelings in me. I'm not going to say hate, but certainly frustration. I'm glad I still have the right to express those feelings. You're a good sport for being here, my friend, but on this, you're just dead wrong.
Thanks, Ezra.
Cheers.